Thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. We're going to be discussing residential unit alterations, best practices for safe and compliant renovations. So joining with me this evening, I have my esteemed colleagues, Jeffrey Sherman, who is a principal at Delson or Sherman Architects, and Chris Alker, who is the Director of Operations and Compliance. He's also our resident architect here at ACAM. And myself, Elise Rosemarin, I'm a Senior Vice President here at ACAM. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just so you know who is presenting, who our esteemed panelists are, I'm going to give you a little bit of their background because they're very impressive, each one of them. So Jeffrey is a founding principal of Delson or Sherman Architects, where his attention to detail and close site involvement during construction sets a standard for design excellence. Jeff received a Master of Architecture from Yale University's School of Architecture and Bachelor of Arts from Brown University, where he now serves as an alumnus interviewer. Very exciting. He is a licensed architect in New York State and an LEED LEED AP. Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today.
Thank you, Elise.
And now our own Chris Alker is a New York State registered architect with a focus on New York City architecture. He studied urban design and theory while attending the University of Texas at Austin. And he immediately followed his studies with an apprenticeship as a master carpenter in the San Francisco Bay Area. Very interesting. His experience includes co-designing and executing luxury single-family apartments and townhouse gut renovation additions. He's worked on the Nature Conservancy's New York City's headquarters, Lucid Motors, Miami and West Palm Beach showrooms, countless zoning feasibility studies, code compliance, landmark preservation consulting, and he also does our walkthroughs and is very often seen and as it, of course, helped to all of our boards. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, gentlemen. All right, so let's get started. So tonight, we'll be doing an overview of the types and scope of alteration agreements, typical prohibited and required work, permits and other paperwork to be filed, best practices for unit dwelling alterations, and then we will do a Q&A. And if you've never participated today, what we usually do is we like to discuss everything, and at the end, we'll do a Q&A. But of course, we offer our information at the end. So if you forget to ask a question during tonight, please email any of us, except for maybe me with architecture questions, and we'll get right back to you as soon as possible. And we're always a resource to you. So let's get started. All right, so Chris, I guess we'll get started with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elise. You want to advance to the next slide?
Sure.
Great. So I'm going to set it up by just breaking down just for a second the different types of alteration agreements that that are industry standards. The different buildings that we manage have different alteration agreements in place, and there's no hard and fast way to do any of these. These are sort of the most common types of agreements. So we often get questions as to from shareholders and board members, do I need an agreement? This is going to happen in a dwelling unit. Do I need an agreement? So normally we say no agreements or permits are required if you are doing things like area rugs, window screens, you want to hang your TV, low voltage wiring, you're doing plug-in lighting, replace your thermostat, any sort of furniture. Most of these are basic move-in, move-out items. The TV hanging and installation of freestanding, not built-in bookshelves, that sort of thing, tend to fall under that, right? It seems to reason. The next level would be a decoration agreement. So a decoration agreement is when it's a little bit more invasive and you tend to have a vendor or a contractor, and that would be things like, I'm going to repaint the apartment, I'm going to re-wallpaper it, I'm going to do window treatments in all my windows. If I'm going to replace certain appliances exclusive of gas appliances, maybe I'm going to do a little new backsplash somewhere. Tile more in dry areas, not necessarily a bathroom. So these are sort of very cosmetic adjustments that can often be done under a decoration agreement. Occasionally boards will allow light fixture changes, for example, on existing junction boxes. Then you get into real alterations, right? And the alterations, they can sort of be divided into major and minor. Minor alterations, what the Department of Buildings would call minor alterations in ordinary plumbing repairs. There's a very specific code section, section 28-105, which actually gives you a full and thorough outline. So your architect, if it can tell you, and usually even if you're having designer and architect work on this, you may not necessarily need to file if it falls under that section, right? If I'm removing an existing demountable partition or pressurized wall, not installing, just removing, you want to replace your countertops, you want to do some millwork built-ins, radiator covers, you're popping in some acoustic windows, maybe you're replacing some fixtures in the exact same place on the exact same rough, junction boxes or plumbing roughs. People often say, oh, I'm replacing my toilet, do I need a permit? No, if it's in the exact same place and you're not moving it anywhere, you're just swapping it out with a new one, that's an ordinary plumbing repair, so you don't necessarily need a permit for that. Sound attenuation and some waterproofing. However, you don't normally get into, like if you're going to replace your wood floor, for example, that's just more cosmetic, but you may want to put sound attenuation down for the acoustic clause. Then the next layer, and what most people are concerned about, is I'm doing a quote major alteration, is when I do need a permit, right? And that includes anything where if I'm going to move a wall, and let's be clear that the Department of Buildings doesn't make a distinction between a pressurized wall or a regular wall. A wall is a wall to them because it obstructs your ability to exit the unit or to change the path of your exit as far as fire code and egress. If you're adding plumbing fixtures, if you're moving plumbing fixtures around, and the most common one, do I need to, if I'm going to convert my tub to a shower? You absolutely do. And the reason is, if you're replacing a tub with a tub, no. But if you're replacing a tub with a shower, yes, because the drain line, for example, has to be the branch piping that goes from your drain outlet on the bottom of your shower back to the riser will need to be larger to accommodate that, because your shower pan cannot hold as much water as a freestanding tub can. So
We should probably explain to everyone what a pressurized wall is.
Absolutely. Why don't you take that, Jeff?
It's just a wall that's not actually connected to anything in any kind of with fasteners. So it's basically a pressure fit wall that's pressing against the floor and the ceiling to hold itself in place. Temporary walls that get added by tenants in apartments are frequently pressurized walls.
Right, and then I remember there was a distinction, like if you would give some lighter air to the top, then it was considered a wall. Is that still the case? Like if it was only up to a certain point and it didn't go all the way to the top, but it was a wall, but it maybe had like a window or something at the top?
I mean, there are all kinds of different sorts of screens and barriers that aren't considered walls. I think you would still probably need a building approval on something like that, but I don't think the DOB cares that much about screens and temporary dividers.
Got it.
While we're on the subject of walls, Jeff, and that was one of my next topic, probably best that we talk about for just a second before we go on to prohibited work is there's often questions about, is my wall load bearing? Is my wall rated? Can you give us your quick thoughts or what you generally see in these types of multifamily residential buildings with that regard?
Well, in terms of fire ratings, any partition inside the apartment probably isn't fire rated, and any partition that is the demising wall of the apartment would be. So whether that demising wall is between you and an adjacent apartment, or between you and the building corridor, or between you and a building chase or riser, in all those conditions, that would be a fire rated separation between you and these other entities. But within the apartment, it's unlikely you would ever find a fire-rated enclosure, and you wouldn't need one, say, between two bedrooms within the unit. In terms of load bearing, that's a trickier thing because there's so much variety out there in terms of building types. Generally, high rises, the only real structural member is going to be a column. But you know, we do a lot of projects that are in different kinds of buildings, smaller row houses that have been turned into apartment buildings. There you often find walls that are or that have become load bearing over time. A lot of these walls weren't even designed to be load bearing, but because of the way that they're arranged, often stacked on top of each other, adjacent to building corridors. And if the beams are running perpendicular to these walls, the beams tend to settle on them over time and they become load bearing. So, so there isn't an easy rule of thumb I can give you. It kind of depends on building type.
How do you determine if the wall is load bearing, and if it is load bearing, and or if it is a rated demising wall of some sort? You know, can I punch a hole in it or run a pipe through it?
Let's see. To answer the first question, if it's load bearing, you can certainly punch a hole and run a pipe through it. The bigger the hole, the more you have to worry about supporting things above. So if you're punching a very large hole, you need to add a lintel. If you're doing a small hole, it's probably going to be between the studs, so it's irrelevant, and you wouldn't need any additional support for, say, a small hole that you would be putting a pipe through. If it's got a fire rating, you do have to worry about fire separation, and there are a range of different design details you can do to accommodate penetration that would go through a fire rated wall. Whether it's, you know, a duct with a fusible link, or you know, just adding a fireproof sealant around a pipe. It sort of depends on the penetration, but there are all sorts of ways to do it.
And all those details will be included in the architect's drawings, and no doubt required by the Department of Buildings, correct?
That's right. Yeah, they want to see all of that.
So the next bit is, you know, clearly, you know, our shareholders and unit owners are going to be doing renovations to their apartments, and I'm sure there's lots of things they can do clearly with cosmetics, moving of walls, changing fixtures, adding bathrooms. But in general, your experience working in a number of apartment buildings in New York City, what sort of prohibited work have you found, whether that's by the Department of Buildings or whether that's by the building itself? Do you have any sort of common items you might
oh yeah, let's see. I could probably come up with a whole list of things. Anything that compromises the structure of the building would be a no-go. So that could be things like channeling into a structural slab, chopping into a column, chopping into the building envelope, usually prohibited. When you get into the building envelope, though, there are all sorts of things that are often prohibited, but not universally prohibited. So things like modifications of building envelopes and changes to building windows and window openings. These kinds of things are often prohibited in the rules of alterations, but even then, buildings will occasionally allow them on a case-by-case basis. You know, there are plenty of buildings that have rules like that, and they'll still allow a through-wall air conditioner to be added, or they may allow ventilation through an exterior wall, especially if it's into a courtyard that's not the primary facade of the building. Window openings is another thing. Like, a lot of buildings have rules against modification of them, but you know, on a case-by-case basis, will often allow you to do that.
What about, speaking of windows, what about landmarks? What about buildings in landmarks districts?
You know, it's funny because people often think they can't do anything in a landmark district, and that's really not true. We do changes to facades and even to building mass in landmark districts. It has to get approved by landmarks, and there are sort of various tiers of approvals, from something as easy as a certificate of no effect, which means you're really not changing things much at all, to a certificate of appropriateness if you're making significant changes that they still deem appropriate. And then you get into very kind of elaborate approvals that will require community board approval and a public hearing before the commissioners. And we get into that quite often whenever we're doing an addition to a building, or whether it's on the roof or the rear. You know, so long as it kind of meets their guidelines, we've had good success at getting approvals.
Well, I think obviously, I think in often cases we hear about people wanting to do work in the most expeditious fashion. If I'm going to replace the windows in my apartment, provided that the co-op board or the condo board says that it's okay, how do I know what sort of window the LPC is likely to approve? Is there some best practice there?
Typically with buildings in landmark districts, there is already a window type that's been approved. So a lot of buildings will actually have that window type as a kind of standard that owners within the building can use and readily access as the standard for the building. And Landmarks likes to rely on that too, because they'd like all the windows to be uniform as well. So I think Landmarks and building management are kind of in alignment on those kinds of issues.
And what about, and we hear this a lot, fireplace. I'd like a fireplace in my house with my new renovation. Can I have that in my apartment?
But that's pretty funny. I mean, typically you can't in an apartment that doesn't have that already, and it comes really down to ventilation. Although they do make these, unvented fireplaces that are alcohol burning and they don't off gas, and that is essentially the same as hanging a picture on the wall. So there is no prohibition that I know, either within buildings or within
like a hearth cabinet or something, right?
Yeah, it's essentially like a Yule log that's going into display. It's an actual fire, but it gives off very little heat and doesn't off gas. But adding a real fireplace, whether it's gas fired or wood burning, really depends on whether there's the flue you can tap into. So that's really going to depend on a fireplace having always been there. But maybe it's sort of fallen in disrepair. It needs the flue relined. But then you get into issues of trying to do that, all the way up the building, and it often requires cooperation from other people who are living above you.
What about the, sorry to interrupt, I was gonna say, what about wet over dry? I know that's a standard rule.
Yeah.
And then why is it prohibited to do, go against the grain when
Is that a law?
Yeah.
It's funny that too is one of those very standardized prohibitions that you find in most buildings in New York City, and at the same time, we often get approvals for doing it. So again, depending on the building, they may have a very relaxed idea about their own bylaws. The reason, of course, that the law is there, or the rule is there, is the chance of springing a leak and flooding somebody who lives below you. So if you're flooding into their bathroom, it's not nearly as bad as if you're flooding into their living room and water raining down over their artwork. So there's good reason why that rule's in place. In buildings that have kind of a relaxed take on this, they will instead require all sorts of waterproofing membranes that will go under the finished floor to try to protect the spaces below. I mean, anyone who does these kinds of jobs will quickly tell you that the wet over dry rule is imperfect at best, and that you may have a bathroom over another bathroom, but if that room is flooded and seriously flooded, that flood is going to spread all over the apartment. So the idea that it's somehow contained just because it's over somebody else's bathroom is really a myth.
Right. And is that somewhat of a similar reason why, that you don't just loosen up on your rules about washer dryers? Does it have anything to do with flooding, or is it more about the infrastructure of the building?
I think washer dryers is always the flooding concern, and also a ventilation concern. Different kinds of dryers have different kinds of ventilation requirements.
So speaking to that, is there any ventilation rule as far as enclosing spaces? So for example, say a dining area has is sectioned off and is used as a bedroom or a library or office, but that kitchen doesn't have a vent. So is that a legal conversion, or is that an example of prohibited work?
Well, the dining room certainly doesn't have any particular requirements. Kitchens do. And it all depends on the kitchen's access to windows. If the kitchen has a window, it doesn't actually need to be ventilated, although it's good practice to always ventilate your kitchens regardless of whether they have a window or not.
Right.
And then if it's more than 30 feet away from a window, then it's no longer called a kitchen. It's called a kitchenette, and it would need to be ventilated.
Got it. And then what if though you enclose the dining room next to the kitchen? So now you're trying to make it into a library or bedroom or an office. Is that, and the kitchen doesn't have a vent or a window, is that type of conversion legal or illegal?
Oh, I see. You mean like if you sort of taken the window away from the kitchen by enclosing the dining room?
I think if you're kind of working maybe with a kitchenette, which doesn't have vents or windows, maybe this is like a example of a studio or something, something small, where the kitchen area and you're kind of just working your space. Is that prohibited to do something like that?
I can see how that could get you in trouble, and it's really because every occupiable space in an apartment has light and air requirements.
Okay.
And if you're adding a wall that then removes the light and air requirements for the space because you've created a separate bedroom or something like that, yeah, you're going to get in trouble, and the Department of Buildings will flag it.
Got it. So you want to make sure you look into that if that specific area, if that specific issue is
we come across that a lot actually when people want to know, can I further divide this space, and they don't realize that those light and air requirements got to be maintained. You know, what is it? 10% of the floor area of the room must be light, and 5% must be ventilation.
That's interesting. So if someone proposed in the building to do that type of work, obviously you need to see the actual scope of the work, but it might not be acceptable.
That's right. That's right. We do calculations for every rooms, and you have to actually show that on your drawings. And quite often rooms are sort of teetering on the brink of what's permissible. So even having a small partition might really throw that off.
Jeff, could we go back for a second to the waterproofing issue with regard to showers? One of the more old school rules that we hear quite often in a number of our building is the requirement to have a lead pan in the shower. I think that there's a lot of newer waterproofing membranes and technology out there. And I'm curious to know, one, what are your thoughts about old versus new technologies? And then two, what if somebody says, well, I need to do a roll-in shower, in which case the lead pan doesn't necessarily work?
Yeah. I don't have a good answer to the last question, which is a problem where accessibility and the desire to avoid flooding just conflict with each other. And I would love to see someone actually work out a solution to that. I'm old school when it comes to waterproofing, and so I'm a big believer in lead pans myself, even though we use all those new technologies for waterproofing other spaces and roofs. So there are fantastic products that are liquid applied membranes like Kemper that we use on roofs, and you can use those in showers. They're rated for showers. And there are plenty of other systems too, fiberglass systems, Latacrete makes a good system, and various other kinds of resins that you can use. But I just don't think anything is quite as reliable as lead. Lead is remarkably inert, and you can easily sort of melt each seam so that it becomes a single monolithic membrane. And,
sorry to interrupt, but for people like me who do not know what that is, can you explain what that is? A lead
sure. A lead pan really is exactly like what it sounds like. Imagine a basin made of lead, and that you make it out of a sheet of lead, and it lines the bottom of your shower, and typically runs up the wall 12 inches, and becomes the waterproof barrier if water ever gets through all the other layers that you have in a shower.
And got it. And so that's your preferred way, and that's considered old school.
Yes, it is.
But you like the old school way. Got it.
I do. Okay. And for people worried about lead as a dangerous thing to have in your apartment, this thing is entirely encapsulated, and so there's no possibility of absorbing any of the lead. It just is there living underneath your tile, creating a kind of perfect barrier for flooding.
Thank you.
I think maybe we should move onto some required work. So Aside from prohibited work, if I'm undertaking an alteration, I think it may shock some people to realize that the alteration agreements that their boards have in place will require them to do more work than they intended to do. They say, well, I just want to retile my bathroom, but that will often trigger other things like branch piping replacement. Could you explain a couple of the things that you've seen or had to do as a part of alterations that you've worked on in the city that these boards or these alteration agreements tend to require as best practices, and
Yeah.
also why are they requiring these things? You know, why do I need to do this extra stuff?
Yeah. I think, waterproofing and soundproofing comes up a lot, soundproofing the floors. But the one you mentioned comes up maybe more than all the others, which is replacing branch piping back to the building risers. And I think this is a way, and it's a pretty smart way that buildings have of replacing their infrastructure over time. I think it'd be not just prohibitive for the building itself to do this work, but incredibly convenient to the people who live there, because it's really disruptive to replace, branch piping. But if you're already doing a renovation there and tearing the place apart, it's the perfect time to do it, and there is no better time to do it. Unfortunately, the people who sort of bear the cost of this are the owners who are doing the renovation. But it is the best possible time to do that work, and it's the only way a building has of replacing those old pipes.
What about hidden conditions? Are there any sort of hidden conditions you might, before somebody goes ahead and puts a hammer through one of their walls or through their floors just for just for kicks to see what's in there before they start a renovation? Have you come across any interesting hidden conditions people should be aware of before they start down this road?
I think everyone has the fantasy that they'll discover like that hidden room, and that doesn't actually come up very often. But the housing stock in New York tends to be pretty old, and there are all kinds of surprises you start discovering when you open these things up. And occasionally it is extra foot or two of space that's available for the taking. More likely, what you find is a pipe exactly where you wanted to put a doorway, or a surprising location for an intercom riser, where you were hoping the hallway was going to be. So those are the kinds of things that are the biggest surprises.
So if you, for example, if I open up a wall, or I take out a wall because I want my kitchen to face onto my living room, so I have one big grand open loft-like space, but I have some drain risers that are in the way, and the building says that's a main drain stack, I can't move it. Do I have to contain that, or what's the protocol for that?
I feel like you might be pandering a little to me right now, Chris, because
I like this trick.
Because that in fact is a trick that we've done on now a couple of jobs, where we actually turned a bunch of gas pipes into a decorative element because they couldn't be moved. So imagine a kitchen that starts looking a little bit more like an old pipe organ, because you've got a whole series of pipes that becomes a kind of screen that separates it off from another space. So that's how we dealt with pipes that couldn't be moved, and that's happened on a couple of different jobs, and they can be pretty striking looking, actually. On some, there was one project in particular where all the exposed hardware was patinaed brass. So we had a specialty painter come in and do a patina brass simulation on these exposed pipes. So it really does have the effect of looking like an old pipe organ.
That's great.
But there's always a workaround when you're confronted by some problem. I mean, it's just an opportunity for some new design idea.
Can you speak a little bit with regard to required work about electrical?
Well, on a lot of these apartments, the old electrical load is insufficient for what people might want to add. This comes up a lot whenever we're adding central air, because central air is a big consumer of power, and so in those cases we'll have to bring additional power up from the cellar, and it can be a real trick finding a way to bring that power up without ruining the lives of everyone who lives below. But we end up managing to do this quite often.
And we often see sub-panel replacement requirements for old fuse plug type boxes. Is that what, is there any particular reason why I can't keep my old fuse box? Is it just dangerous, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen too many old fuse boxes that are still in use, but I would say,
one.
Oh, do you really?
I don't recommend it. Yeah.
Wow.
They don't sell the fuses anymore.
It wasn't good. It wasn't good for blow drying. I'll let you know.
Yeah, I think they aren't terribly reliable, and people had a bad habit of sticking pennies in to jump the circuit because they didn't want to replace the fuses. A circuit breaker is a much safer and more reliable system for preventing overloads and electrocution. And there are a lot of things you can't do with an old fuse box. Like I don't think you can even do a proper GFCI, which is a ground fault circuit interrupt with an old fuse box.
What could you explain people why and when you would have GFCIs?
Yeah, you've probably all seen this. And in a bathroom, it's the outlet that has a little push button that you can reset. You've probably seen them in hotels if you don't have one at home. And they prevent electrocution. So it immediately senses and trips a breaker when there's a spike in the power. That's in a bathroom where you're standing in a pool of water and you accidentally shock your finger, it'll trip that and shut off the power to the outlet. So they're a great safety feature, but I'm not sure they're even compatible with old fuse boxes. They're designed to work with circuit breakers.
Excellent.
Not compatible for hair drying.
Yeah.
And not with straighteners at the same time. No, I'm kidding. But it sounds like that's what my experience was as well.
So I guess the next piece that we wanted to talk about were sort of all the other sort of bits. I mean, we've talked about sort of the meat of the alterations, prohibited work, required work, things that you're going to encounter. But then there's a whole process to doing an alteration. And one of the biggest things that's a requirement we see amongst alteration agreements and boards is a scope of work. Scopes of work, are basically a description of what work you're going to do in detail so that the board knows what you're doing, so they can basically determine which alteration agreement should be matched with that scope of work. And in the event that scope of work is, say, a true alteration, most likely you will need to face a peer architect review. Now, one of the biggest things that we have an issue or shareholders have issues with is, okay, so I have to have an architect review my architect's plans, and it's going to be at my cost, and it's going to take time, and I might go, and they're very concerned that it's going to take a lot of time, and I'm going to have to go round and round and round. I was hoping, Jeff, you could speak to your experience having your work reviewed and how do we make that a less painful process? I mean, how do we coordinate with that architect? How do we give them what they want, and how do we know when that architect is being reasonable or unreasonable, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm going to have a good answer for you. I mean, I think the first step is hiring an architect, yourself, who has experience doing this kind of work, because that's going to get you a lot further down the road towards an approvable set of drawings. I think, for the most part, I found that the reviewing architects tend to be pretty reasonable. I'm not sure it's always, as expeditious a process as it could be. It often seems to take too long. So it can be really a drawn out, slow process waiting for those approvals to come in. And it's a real bummer that, my client has to also pay for that architect's fee. You're sort of, paying for the enemy to do his work on you.
Well, would it be kosher for you to speak with the architect directly, or just wait to answer his questions by way of his report? How informal and formal should it? Have you dealt with this situation?
That's interesting. Well, the initial submission always goes through building management, and that they interact with the reviewing architect or reviewing engineer in some cases. Once we get responses back, though, we have corresponded directly with, once you have their, their title block in front of you, it's got their address and phone number, so it's easy to make contact. And I think that's probably the quickest way to get answers, rather than have to go back through building management and then, do the circuitous path. And by and large, building architects are certainly willing to discuss things with you directly. I think we're all relieved to be in a situation where you can actually have a conversation on the phone, because we're also used to dealing with the Department of Buildings where you can't do that. So the ability to actually just send an email or pick up the phone and get to the bottom of a problem, I think everyone appreciates that.
Well, speaking of the Department of Buildings, since you brought it up, often we hear horror stories about the Department of Buildings and that process. I'm wondering if you might give us any thoughts you might have on sort of how do you what's the purpose of the permitting process with regard to submissions of plans, and how do you sort of mitigate that sort of agency, which often can be a little bit onerous?
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I think most of the bad stories that people have heard about the Department of Buildings are true, but it's funny. Someone just asked me about this just this past week, and I'll defend them on this one count. They said, "Aren't they really corrupt?" And I think in the past they were quite corrupt, and there was this payola process where you would slip someone a 20 or 1,000 or whatever it took, and get your project approved. I have not found that to be the case remotely anymore, and I've heard people lament that they can't do that anymore, because you used to be able to get stuff approved and get your project on track so much more quickly in the old days. So the one good thing I can say about them is they do not seem to be corrupt at all, but it is a remarkably inefficient process, and I think maybe what's even more frustrating for me is the idea of trying to follow the building code. Or trying to follow zoning resolutions, because it's not just a matter of closely reading the code and doing your best to follow the rule, because that rule is then subject to the interpretation of the plan examiner, or the interpretation, say, of the entire Department of Buildings, who may have kind of a different take on how that rule should be interpreted. And so they're not following the letter of the law at all, they're following their own precedent. And so learning about what is and isn't possible is really one of knowing the precedents that have been previously approved.
Would it be safe to say that the person who might be able to help you deliver that information would be a very good expediter?
That's exactly right. And that's the weird thing about New York. In other parts of the country, you don't need expediters. You just call up the Department of Buildings, ask a question, and then submit your drawings, and that's the end of that. So we find it very easy when we're doing jobs around the country, but yeah, in New York City, you need an expediter, and that's why.
And without being redundant, can you guys just touch upon what an expediter is, or what it does?
Yeah, an expediter is the curious animal in New York City that you hire to get your drawings through the Department of Buildings. And they have sort of day-to-day intimate knowledge of the processes that go on there. And it is Kafkaesque and a black box. So if you don't have that kind of insider information, you're just going to be lost in this labyrinth. So they basically push the papers through and know what papers need to be pushed through, and know what window to stand in front of, and what, how to make an appointment to see that guy, and what that entails. So I am, indebted to the expeditors that I work with, and mystified by the process on a daily basis. But they also wind up having this kind of inside understanding of codes, because they know that it's not just about what the code says, but also it's about what that plan examiner approved last week. And so they know what he will approve this coming week. Yeah, so that's why you pay expeditors.
So let's say you make it through a plan exam, I'm ready to pull my permit. There are some hurdles to clear before you can pull that permit, and that leads me to asbestos abatement, for example. When does that come up? When am I worried about asbestos? I mean, I look around my apartment, I don't see any asbestos. Where would I find that? What does it look like? What the heck is that?
It's a very hard thing to spot. I would say the only sort of giveaway for asbestos that's fairly reliable is a 9-inch by 9-inch floor tile that looks like vinyl floor tile. It's a weird dimension of floor tile, and it only comes up with asbestos floor tiles. Other than that, you'll find it in pipe insulation, but not all pipe insulation. So it's a little bit hard to tell whether that, white crusty stuff around your pipe.
Popcorn ceilings.
Popcorn ceilings. Well, this is the funny thing about asbestos is that for a while there, it was used almost everywhere. So it could just be in plaster. We often find it in roofing. So it'll be roofing tar, it'll be in a roofing membrane. But the places interior that you find it are very typically in pipe insulation and in floor tiles. And if it's in your plaster, God help you, because inevitably that, asbestos, you're charged basically by the square foot, and plaster quickly winds up being a lot of square feet if you're doing a renovation. I
had that actually myself as well. I had it
Oh
all.
no.
Yeah, during a renovation, it was expensive to
Oh
remove.
gosh.
So you have to take it out. You have to take it out before you start your work, or you can do it as a part of your work. Like how's the?
Yeah, there are all different ways to do it.
To get too in the weeds on the forms per se.
Yeah, and you don't actually even have to take it out. It's a little bit like the lead that we were talking about before. Often in projects that have a lot of asbestos, what we do is encapsulate it. So we essentially bury it behind flooring, bury it behind wall boards, bury it behind coatings. And asbestos is a terrific product if you can completely bury it. It's only bad if you're breathing it in. So that's the first thing you would try to do if you had a lot of asbestos is encapsulate it. If you then plan to remove it because it's in the way of a wall or a ceiling that you're going to remove, there's a very specific process and protocol you have to follow to ensure the safety not only of the people who live in the building, but of the people who are working around the asbestos. And that project is then filed with the DEP. And there are a whole host of different forms that need to be completed by an asbestos testing company, establishing where the asbestos is, and then later establishing that it has been removed.
And for our viewers, DEP is Department of Environmental Protection. Okay, and then, when you're doing any of these sorts of projects, and you're let's say, so now I know I'm in a good place. I either do or don't have asbestos. I'm queued up and I need to hire a contractor. Obviously, they're gonna need to have insurance requirements. We know that they need to be licensed in New York City. Do you have any thoughts about how you go about finding a good contractor? I know a lot of people. I personally am one of those people, and I think probably came from working in the past on these types of projects, is you sort of get what you pay for.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know what you think about how do I find a good contractor for this work without spending. I don't want to blow my bank account, but at the same time, I want to know I have a quality product and nothing's going to leak and upset my neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I think you do basically get what you pay for with contractors. So really good contractors are quite expensive, and pretty bad contractors are often, a real bargain until you get around to dealing with the problems that they've created. I think word of mouth is the best way to actually find a contractor. So, we go back to the same contracting pool again and again. There are half a dozen contractors that we work with on project after project because they give great value for their quality of construction, and because they're real craftsmen, and because they're really reliable, and they don't do, those horror stories you hear about people walking off the job for 6 months and, or not coming back and finishing because they were, received most of their money and it was enough for them. The contractors we go back to again and again are real professionals who take a lot of pride in the quality of their work. But that said, on any given job, we'll do a competitive bid and bring in contractors that, a client has a friend who had a good experience with, or somebody else in the building did a project with them and they thought they were great. And we've met a lot of terrific contractors that way. I would always say go to somebody who's had an experience working with this person and had some good results.
Inevitably, there are going to be owners and shareholders that are going to hire contractors and architects who may not be up to snuff, whether they are or they're not. From a board's perspective, I'm curious to know, how am I checking on work? What are the sort of, are there, should I schedule times when I'm going to look at progress in the apartment? When should I do that if that's required, and or any required sort of inspections that are required, not just by not just by the city, but best practice inspections before you move to the next stage of work?
Oh, that's very interesting. I have not heard of too many buildings that had a member of the board or even a representative of the board who would come and do that. But I think it's actually a great idea. More typically, what I find with really well-managed buildings is that there's a very involved super who makes regular site visits. And you're right that there are critical points during the construction process when you want to have those site visits. It's typically after all the walls are framed up, after the plumbing, the rough plumbing and the electrical wiring has been done, but before any walls are closed up and before any finishes or hide any of that work. That's a really important time to come and check out the work because that's really where you can see everything that'll later be hidden behind those finishes. And then at the end of the job too, I think it's important for the super to come, and that's what we try to do, is engage the super to come at those critical milestones. Not just because we want to reassure the building, but also because that super, 10 years from now it'll be useful if he's seen what's behind the walls. In 10 years when somebody has a problem, or when somebody wants to break through from the other unit, he's actually seen what's in there, and I think that's really critical to the proper functioning of a building.
I hadn't even considered that, and we do have a lot of supers in our buildings and a lot of buildings with unions, and we have long tenured staff in a number of our buildings, and I'm sort of amazed at the history they have in their heads about their buildings and the entire infrastructure of their buildings. It's wild. They
really do. That's our first point of contact when we want to find out about the workings of a building, is to talk through the whole thing with the super.
Definitely.
All right, so should we get to best practices?
Yes, I think this is we're just before Q&A, aren't we, Elise?
You sure are. Yeah, so I guess it's a good time for everyone to start loading in any questions you might have, and then Chris and Jeff will be happy to answer them.
So best practice is anything that maybe I would like to. One thing I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about waterproofing. I'm curious to know. I know that your company is sort of very prideful about the use of materials, and I'm curious to know what you think about materials in various situations in terms of best practice. And I guess I always immediately think cleanliness, and or maintenance of materials to kick off best practices.
Well, it's interesting because from my point of view, it's a very different perspective, I think, than what a board would worry about, and what and even what a building management company would worry about in terms of that. So cleanliness is a huge issue with us, but we're usually not too involved in what's happening in the building corridor. It's really what's happening in the interior of the apartment. We put a lot of time and attention into finishes especially in sort of trade heavy rooms like kitchens and bathrooms, where the ability to not only keep something clean, but its durability, whether it's going to look good in the long term, whether it'll develop a patina or not develop a patina, and whether the client actually likes it that way or prefers something that's sort of immaculate. So we spend a lot of time working through those kinds of issues with clients, but you tell me if that's the sort of thing that a building would really concern itself with.
I don't think I was thinking more from a shareholder perspective, not from a building perspective.
Yeah,
I'm curious to know if you might divulge a couple of tips or tricks that you think our shareholders might like to hear about with regards to that.
Let's see. Well, in terms of materiality, there are a few new products on the market that I think are really interesting, and they're essentially gigantic porcelain tiles, and they go by different names: porcelain slabs, sintered stone. But imagine a porcelain tile that's no thicker than a 1/4 inch. That could be the size of a wall, and so the idea of being able to do, say, a shower wall, all in this one giant tile, and eliminate, all those grout joints that inevitably cause problems over time.
Isn't it heavy?
It's not that heavy because it's so thin.
So
It's quite fragile though before you install it. So you got to take a lot of care during the installation process. Once it's installed, it's about as durable as a stone wall, but it's very fragile while you're getting it in place. And you could get them with all kinds of finishes. So it could look like like a giant white tile if you want, but it could also look like surprisingly exactly like marble or like granite.
What about, we often hear the age-old debate about, oh my gosh, I gotta have hardwood floors, but then there's so many newfangled engineered types of floorings. I don't know if you have thoughts on the differences or sort of newer products. Like, why would I do an engineered floor? Why wouldn't I do a full thick hardwood floor? I mean, is one better than the other?
Well, I'm old school about waterproofing. I'm not old school about flooring. I can see that a thick hardwood floor has its kind of appeal, and so I can certainly appreciate that. And if I were doing maybe a restoration of a historic gem that really called for keeping all the original materials, I would go with a solid hardwood floor. But in almost every other circumstance, an engineered floor is a better bet and performs a lot better. And just so everyone knows what we're talking about, an engineered floor is essentially a floor made like plywood, where you have a bunch of layers of wood that are laminated together. The top layer is as thick as the wear layer on a solid piece of wood. And by that, I mean that a solid piece of wood is only good until you sand all the way down to where the tongue and groove is. Once you get down to the tongue and groove, that floor has to be thrown out. Engineered floor, a good engineered floor is made the same way, where you have an equally thick wear layer made of hardwood. And the nice thing about it is because you're using a smaller portion of it, the rest of the floor can be made of some cheap, easily renewable wood, like a pine or a bamboo. And you can really spend the money on the fancy hardwood that you see, which could be a much more expensive and rare hardwood because you're using so much less of it. So beyond the sustainable issues, it just performs a lot better too. Solid wood tends to expand and contract quite a bit from season to season as the temperature and humidity changes in the environment. And inevitably what will happen is, especially with the wide plank floors that are popular right now, with a really wide plank floor, when you have that kind of expansion and contraction, you don't have a lot of joints to sort of take up the movement, and you wind up with big gaps. So if you're doing any kind of wide plank floor, I think an engineered floor is a must for that reason, because it's so much more dimensionally stable and won't have that kind of gapping over time that you inevitably get with hardwood.
How does hardwood floor handle acoustic issues? Because is it, there's standpoint of doing that, is it different with engineer?
No, hardwood and engineered are virtually identical with the way that they transmit sound, so there's not going to be much difference there. But the solution to both is equally easy. A very thin layer of an acoustically absorbent material.
Can you give an example of that, like a rug, I imagine, or?
on top, yeah, sure, that would work. But there are thin layers made of felt or rubber or. Okay. Homosote, all kinds of products that you put underneath the floor, so you never see it, and it absorbs the sound of a high-heeled shoe stomping across that floor late at night.
Well,
So you won't
yeah.
disturb your downstairs neighbor.
I would think that that's a big concern because I've seen several questions come in considering noise in different regard. One would be, about how do you handle noise and acoustic treatments in regard to construction. I guess we'll answer that first.
Yeah.
And we'll go into the other question.
Well, the requirement that we see is that basically if you're replacing the floor, you need to put a soundproof layer underneath the new floor. And that's become a pretty common requirement that comes up a lot. And it's a minor additional cost. I mean, it's really very little to add that layer and really doesn't change much of anything, but makes a huge difference to the people who live below you.
Yeah, I bet. And is there any noise abatement requirement during construction or prohibited machinery, as far as noise? Again, we're talking about apartment living.
Yeah, well, it's pretty standard to not be allowed to use any, sort of pneumatic equipment. So any powered equipment that's going to make a lot of noise, like a jackhammer or anything like that, you would not be allowed to use. And then typically there are all kinds of rules about when that work can go on, and some buildings are incredibly strict about that, and only allow the work during summer months when half the people are gone. Other buildings have much more relaxed rules about it. It's essentially a 9 to 5 or a 9 to 6 kind of weekday schedule.
And
but you don't need. Sorry.
I was just going to say, let's say you are a little bit noisy, your contract's a little bit noisy. How do you is there any tips or tricks on, how do I make sure that that I don't upset my neighbors? I mean, we all know that alterations, they cause a little bit of dust, they cause a little bit of noise, they cause a little bit of disruption. Is there anything we can do to sort of minimize the impact on the balance of the residents around?
I mean, one of the things we always recommend with our clients is to sort of meet their neighbors and have a conversation with the neighbors first. I think the way you frame your upcoming project makes a huge difference in how it's received by the people around you that you're disturbing. Buy a bottle of wine for your neighbors before this all happens. Explain to them the duration that you expect the project to last. Tell them what it is that you're going to be doing.
How many bottles of wine?
Yeah, and then beyond that, we like to actually, if the neighbor's willing, we'll go in and document the condition of their apartment before the work starts. That way, if there is a crack that appears in the wall suddenly, we have documentation. This is actually designed to protect our own clients.
That's a really strong. It's a great idea.
Yeah, but it protects the neighbor as well. And I think the dust issue that you raised is every bit as important as the noise issue. And our specifications always have fairly elaborate requirements for dust shielding to protect the leakage of dust outside the apartment into the hallway and into neighbors' apartments. Even then, it's very difficult to contain all that stuff. But anything we can do to mitigate the disruption and the harm to other people, we're trying to do.
This might be a loud sound. Can someone use a pneumatic gun or an airless trim gun for trim and flooring? Does that make sound? I don't know. I don't even know what that is.
It does make sound.
Okay, I figured it sounded loud.
Yeah, it's a loud pop, it's sort of on a case-by-case basis because different buildings have different rules about that. I could see it being an issue.
It's pretty tough to install a wood floor, I imagine, right, without some of these tools.
Yeah. Well, wood floor maybe not as hard as the trim. The trim's pretty tough to install without.
Recessed finishing nails, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot, like gallons of wine, if you're asking for or wine of the month club for years.
Wine and cheese.
There you go. So regarding asbestos, which we touched upon before, does someone have to do an asbestos test? Do they have to get a test accomplished if they're going to be tearing down walls or remodeling bathrooms, new tile, new concrete board, etc.? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're doing any demolition at all, so if essentially anything that's part of the apartment is being removed, the Department of Buildings will require asbestos test.
And that's for buildings though after what I think it's 1980.
1980, yeah. I thought it was 1980.
Maybe you're right.
Yeah, but so yeah, if you're in the lucky position of being in a brand new building, you won't have to. But most of the housing stock in New York will require an asbestos test.
Got it. All right. So now this is I hope I get this question delivered correctly. All right. So if an owner wants to make his tiny enclosed kitchen to an open kitchen, I think the board requires a soffit around the kitchen footprint, but they've also seen a lot of kitchen renovation photos on the internet where it shows fully, open kitchens without soffits. How does someone explain to the owner that they are required to keep the soffit, even though on the internet it looks like you don't need to?
The internet.
I guess this is the interwebs.
Yes. I would say there are all kinds of code requirements, especially in New York, which is a particularly code-heavy place to live, that don't exist, in other parts of the world. I'm constantly getting bombarded by stair photos that show, stair handrails, or stairs with no handrails, or stairs with incredibly minimal handrails. And they're I love those stairs too. They're really sexy, but they're not allowed in New York. So the requirement for the soffit around the kitchen is actually specific to kitchenettes. And it all has to do with how far away they are from the windows. So if the rear wall of the kitchen is more than 30 feet from the window, then you need that drop soffit. It's a smoke apron. I suppose you could turn it around and say, like, if you could establish that your kitchen is compliant and is actually within that 30-foot boundary, you could make the argument that it doesn't need that. But that's the reason for it.
Got it. The short answer is call Jeff Sherman, right? He'll tell you. All right, perfect. So let's get to a few more questions, and then it is a beautiful evening, and I'm sure people would like to get into that summer weather, but we'll have a few more questions. So, you guys have spoken a lot from the architectural standpoint, and it's good, I think, for boards to also know, what to look for as far as a strong contractor. How do you go about, we at ACAM obviously have resources available to all our boards from a board level as far as who to find and how to find a good contractor. But what are some things that you look for in a good contractor besides for showing up? No, I'm kidding. Yeah.
I'm not sure this is going to be helpful to just about anyone else, but what we always do if we're about to work with a contractor that we haven't worked with before is we'll call up other architects that they've worked with. Mm-hmm. And find out how they behaved with architects, because it's always especially critical to us that they be able to read drawings properly, or follow the specifications, or that they're good with the paperwork on their end to make sure that we're actually getting submittals and getting change orders when they're supposed to submit them.
Could you tell people, and I was going to say paperwork as well, because I'm all about crispy paperwork, but can you tell people what a change order and a submittal is?
Oh, yeah. Typically on a construction job, you sign a contract with the contractor that the contractor will do the work that your architect has drawn up in these specifications and drawings for a stipulated amount of money. And you're locked in at that price. And the only legal way to change that dollar amount is with a change order, or a construction change directive, which no one ever uses. But the change order is essentially the only way to change the contract price. And change orders come up whenever there's a change to the scope of work. So it could be a change because the owner of the apartment decided that he wants to renovate 2 bathrooms instead of 1 bathroom. But it might come up because somebody found that all the floorboards are rotted and need to be replaced, but they couldn't tell because it was carpeting in the way when everyone was doing their first walkthroughs. It wasn't until
and time, correct?
Price and time, that's absolutely right. So the time is established at the same time that the price is established before the contract is signed.
And the submittal?
Submittal, you probably also heard of shop drawings. Submittals and shop drawings are essentially the same thing, and they are let's say an architect creates drawings and specifications that go to a contractor. Submittals and shop drawings are essentially the same kind of product. They are drawings and specifications that come back from the contractor to the architect. And they show how the contractor plans to put together the thing that you've designed. The submittal will describe in some detail the actual product that the contractor is going to buy, and the quantity and the color and the finish and all of the, all the details involved in what they're purchasing. And all this stuff is just a check to make sure that the contractor is understanding what the construction documents say.
So what if you put something in the specification and the contractor sends you a submittal and it doesn't match?
Yeah. The first thing that happens is the antenna go up because you're alarmed that they're sending you something that doesn't match. Sometimes there's a good reason for it, like the toilet you specified has been discontinued and they're sending you a submittal for Toto's new toilet. That's almost the exact same toilet, but it's got a different catalog number. So that happens all the time. It's always nice to get a heads up when they're sending you something that's different from what you sent them. But every once in a while they want to make a substitution because they found something that does just what your product did, but maybe it's less expensive or maybe it's ready immediately, whereas there was a long lead time on the product that you had specified. So there are plenty of good reasons that they might make that change. And sometimes there are bad reasons, like they're taking a shortcut and they found something cheaper that they want to use because they don't want to spend the money that it was going to cost them to buy the expensive thing that you wrote down. And then you tell them no.
That's good tips. Okay, so we're going to do two last questions here. And this really, I think, does help pertain with the board. If someone is combining apartments, does the building need to change its certificate of occupancy?
Oh, that's such a good question. And the answer is no, for the most part. That in a multifamily dwelling, you can reduce the number of dwellings and not change the C of O. So you can,
Why?
I don't have a good answer for that. It's sort of like knowing the mind of God, the way the code is
The
written.
same reason why the expediter exists.
Yeah, exactly.
I always wondered, was it because you're decreasing the amount of kitchens and potentially egress? I don't know.
I think egress is definitely the reason that if you split an apartment into two, you've increased the amount of egress that's required for that apartment and increased the burden of egress on the rest of the building. So you have to make sure that the egress path is now adequate for the increased occupancy that you've created. When you combine apartments, all you're doing is reducing occupancy. So you're easing the burden of egress all the way down the line.
And what do you mean by egress, Jeff, for those of
Oh, sure. Basically, it's the way out of the building. And it's of particular concern to the Department of Buildings in case of emergencies like a fire. And so there are all kinds of rules about the path of egress and the fire rating around that path and the width and accessibility of that path. The number of people trying to escape in a fire is all determined by the occupancy. So when you reduce that number, you make it easier for all those people to get out. And that's why you don't have to change the C of O when you reduce the number of units.
There you go. Good question. All right, if you combine units, speaking of, how easy is it to then merge them into tax parcels?
I think it's quite easy to do that. Yeah, it's funny. I don't have a lot of experience with that end of it. I have more experience with combining zoning lots to create a larger zoning lot. But that's typically with individual row houses or individual buildings where they will combine their zoning lots, often to have the ability to suddenly build larger. You could get around the sliver law when you have a wide enough piece of property to escape the sliver law that lets you build bigger. I haven't heard of people doing it with individual apartments, but there may be some reason for doing so.
I believe that when you are, if memory serves, when you are combining apartments, you don't have to change the C of O, but you do need to make an adjustment to there's a tax filing that needs to be done with the clerk's office in conjunction before you can complete that. I think it might be a prerequisite we can get further information on that. But memory serves that came up recently in one of our combined units that came across my desk.
All right.
Our filing process with that usually stops at the Department of Buildings. So the Department of Finance seems to, is kind of notified about these things by the Department of Buildings, but it's not something that the architect actually gets involved in.
Interesting. All right, and then
So it would be so it would theoretically be on the shareholder or the owner of the apartment to handle.
Yeah, that's right.
Good, thank you. And then one last question, which I'm sure definitely is concern to boards because insurance is very expensive. So, can you discuss typical insurance requirements and I guess ways to be proactive? We're coming from the board's perspective of making sure the building doesn't take, risks for exposure. Can you discuss some just typical things that you see?
Every building has its own sort of dollar value that they're looking for. There's typically the sort of, case by case dollar value, which might be something like $1 million. And then there's an umbrella policy that they'll require of the GC that will be something like $5 million. But there are plenty of buildings where that number gets much higher. And it's entirely dependent on the building. Then beyond that, there are always requirements for workers' comp and for liability and trying to remember all the insurance buzzwords.
Maybe auto coverage is a common one too.
Oh, auto, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Which is funny because we never think about that being in New York City. None of us own cars.
Yeah.
And if you're doing say there's a lot of work being done in your building and you're seeing that a lot of, units are being changed over, is it important to maybe increase the insurance coverage, or is that not really something you should think about? I'm just thinking if there's more bodies in the building that are working, you're leaving yourself maybe more open for issues to occur.
Oh, I thought maybe where you were going with that was that all this work is increasing the value of the building, and the value of the apartments. So,
that's true.
So I think that's certainly a point. Having lots of different jobs going on in a building would be incredibly inconvenient for the people living there. But each one of those general contractors will be carrying their own insurance, and so. In some ways, like the more contractors you have working, the more the building's protected because there are so many more policies that are in place at a given moment. That's probably not very reassuring for the people living under it.
And they're all required to have tenant protection plans, right, Joe?
Yes, yeah, that's become a very big part of the construction process in New York these days.
And what could you give us a summary of what's a TPP?
Yeah, there's a tenant safety plan that has to be filed for every renovation in the city, and it extends from very small projects. If you're changing the building envelope, you need a construction supervisor, and there are different categories of safety professionals that are required for different sizes of project. I think. When it's a 9-story building and higher, you jump up to the next category. Our jobs typically involve construction supers. And this will be a person on staff at the general contractor's staff that's been licensed to be a safety officer. It mostly comes into play because there are frequent inspections by the Department of Building to make sure that a site safety plan is in place and to make sure that the site safety officer is on site. And the general contractor can be hit with some serious fines if that stuff isn't in place. And stop work orders, which typically were a very rare thing, have become much more common because of these rules.
Scary. You said a scary word. Ooh, stop.
Don't want that to happen. We're not going to end on a scary note, are we?
We shouldn't.
Oh, man. Well, you guys have been fantastic. Chris Alker, Jeff Sherman, I really want to thank you for all your time and information. You have been wonderful. And I'm sure our boards have agreed. So, if anything comes up, alteration wise, architecture questions, please feel free to reach out to Jeff and Chris. And we would be happy to facilitate any further questions that you have. And enjoy this wonderful evening and hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much and have a great night.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
Liz.
Chris.
Thanks, Jeff.